Hey, I'm Griffin, and I love reading, writing, and talking about fantasy literature. Welcome to my channel, and thank you so much for being here. Now, if you are at all immersed in the world of modern fantasy literature, then you're probably at least a little bit familiar with Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere. But if you aren't familiar with the Cosmere, then allow me to briefly explain it. The Cosmere is a vast, interconnected universe in which the majority of Brandon Sanderson's novels take place. Now, for new readers, diving into the Cosmere can be daunting for a couple of reasons. For one thing, a lot of the books in the Cosmere contain Easter eggs and tie-ins and connections to other books in the Cosmere universe. And if you haven't read much of the Cosmere or any of the Cosmere, then you are not going to understand a lot of these references. And secondly, there are a whole lot of books in the Cosmere. There are currently over 15 novels, as well as several novellas and some collections of short stories. And there isn't necessarily a defined reading order for new readers, although there are plenty of other guides out there. Which brings me to my next point, which is I know I am far from the first person to make a Cosmere reading order guide. I know this is not exactly an original concept. However, it seems like everyone has their own opinions and takes on the right way to read the Cosmere, and I thought it would be fun to share mine. And I should also disclose that this is not actually the order in which I read the Cosmere when I started my journey, but if I could rewind the clock and do it all over again, I think this is probably how I would do it. So, without further ado, here is my simple Cosmere reading order guide, starting with... Okay, if you're brand new to the Cosmere, then my recommendation would be that you start with Mistborn Era 1. Now, well, pretty much all of Brandon Sanderson's books are pretty accessible compared to a lot of other fantasy. I would argue that the first era of Mistborn is maybe the most accessible for new readers and people who are new to the Cosmere. Mistborn, if you aren't familiar with it, is a fantasy heist story. It has a unique, fleshed out magic system. It has a fun, interesting group of kind of outcast main characters. It has a very scary, formidable main antagonist. This series, it features a nice blend of fast-paced action, political intrigue and drama, and even some romance. Mistborn also has a really unique, fleshed-out magic system that adds a ton to the story, which is not uncommon when it comes to Brandon Sanderson's work. Now, while Mistborn isn't necessarily my favorite series in the Cosmere, I do think it's a great place and maybe the single best place to start if you're a new reader to the Cosmere universe. Next up, I would recommend, if you want to, reading Mistborn Era 2, the Wax and Wane era. Now, this is probably my personal least favorite series in the Cosmere. It's not bad. I did enjoy some of it, especially the last book, which is kind of a bummer if the last book is the first one you really enjoy, but I did power through. But I would say that Mistborn Era 2 is probably a bit more optional than a lot of the other stuff in the Cosmere. It's really up to you. I would think a lot of people will read Era 1 and Era 2 back to back, which is totally fine. You might also want to read Era 1 and then come back and read Era 2 later on, which is also fine. Honestly, it's even fine if you want to skip Era 2 altogether. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but I don't personally have a problem with it. I think it's a fine series, but I don't think it's on the same level as the majority of the stuff in the Cosmere. And before I move on, I just want to mention this novella, Mistborn Secret History, which I would recommend reading either between Era 1 and Era 2 of Mistborn, or while you're in the middle of Era 2, or even just after you've finished both Era 1 and Era 2. But it's definitely worth reading. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. A lot more Easter eggs and little bits of information that kind of make the world of the Cosmere just feel that much more lived in and fleshed out and interesting. Okay, so next up, or as an alternative starting point, we have the two currently standalone novels, Elantris and Warbreaker. Now, Elantris is currently a standalone, but there is a sequel coming out in the fairly near future, and I believe it's going to be a trilogy when all is said and done. So personally, I think that both Elantris and Warbreaker are great books to read early on in your Cosmere journey. For one thing, they were both written very early in Brando Sando's writing journey. I believe that Elantris was the first book that he got published. So if you're someone who likes to read an author's books in publication order, then you want to start with Elantris. I really just enjoy both of these books a lot and their concepts. Each one has its own unique magic system. You'll learn as you get into the Cosmere that if there's one thing Brandon Sanderson knows how to do, it is write a hard, intricate, thought-out magic system, and these books are definitely not exceptions to that rule. Another thing about Elantris and Warbreaker is that they don't feature too many Cosmere tie-ins and Easter eggs, so if you're reading them pretty early in your Cosmere journey, there's not going to be a whole lot of stuff that you don't understand, which isn't necessarily the case with some of his other books. So yeah, these two books should both be totally accessible, no matter how much other Cosmere stuff you've read. Whether you want to start with these or read these after Mistborn, I think those are both great choices, and these two are both absolutely worth reading. I enjoyed both these books a lot. Okay, next up we get into the real meat of the Cosmere, and that is the Stormlight Archive. So when I started my Cosmere journey several years ago, this is actually where I started. I picked up Way of Kings, and the rest is history. Now that worked for me, but I probably wouldn't recommend doing it that way. You're welcome to, and it might work, but there are a couple reasons why I think Stormlight Archive should probably be read a little bit later on in your Cosmere journey. So if you already have read Mistborn and Elantris and Warbreaker before you read Stormlight Archive, I think that's a good call, because at that point you should already know, or at least have a pretty good idea of if you like the Cosmere and if you like Brandon Sanderson's writing. And on some level, I think you will need that trust to really enjoy your Stormlight Archive experience. The reason I say that you need some trust for the Stormlight Archive is because the first book, The Way of Kings, it definitely starts a bit slow. There is quite a bit of setup and world building, which is totally understandable and completely necessary for a series of this scope that's such an ambitious, large-scale series. You need some time to set it up. But if you don't already know that you like Brandon Sanderson's writing, then it might be a little bit tedious to get through that first chunk of Way of Kings. But once you're past that, if you're enjoying yourself, then you are in for a hell of a ride through the Stormlight Archive. So as you get deeper into the Stormlight Archive, you're going to start noticing more Easter eggs, more connections, more tie-ins to other parts of the Cosmere. But if you've already read Mistborn and Elantris and Warbreaker and Mistborn's Secret History, then you will understand a lot of those. You're going to be equipped to appreciate a lot more of those connections, and that will enhance your reading experience for sure. Overall, Stormlight Archive is my favorite series in the Cosmere, and honestly, one of my favorite series of all time. And I think that if you want to get the most out of your Stormlight Archive reading experience, you should read some other stuff in the Cosmere first. However, you don't have to, but that's what I would recommend. And before I move on, I just want to note that these two novellas, Edge Dancer and Dawn Shard, I would include them as part of the Stormlight Archive. Edge Dancer, I believe, is actually in the book Oathbringer, which is the third book of Stormlight Archive. As for Dawn Shard, I feel like you can kind of read it at any point while you're reading the Stormlight Archive. Probably later is better, but it's not anything that's going to spoil the reading experience. But it does have some Cosmere tie-ins. In fact, it's pretty much all Cosmere tie-ins. So if you've already got your Stormlight Archive knowledge, then you might enjoy Dawn Shard more than you otherwise would. All right, now we're really getting deep into the Cosmere journey with Brandon Sanderson's Secret Project Cosmere novels, of which there are 4 novels. There's Tress of the Emerald Sea, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, The Sunlit Man, and Isles of the Emberdark. Now, honestly, I would say you can read these 4 novels in pretty much any order. I would say most people probably go in order of publication date, which is what I went with. The only thing I would say is that you should probably read Isles of the Emberdark last out of the 4, no matter what order you read the other 3 in. The reason I would recommend this is because Isles of the Emberdark has some pretty broad, substantial Cosmere reveals and connections, and I will just say I was really glad that I had already read pretty much everything else in the Cosmere before I got to this book. Now, that being said, all 4 of these secret projects have a fair amount of Cosmere tie-ins, which is why I would recommend waiting to read them until you've read most of the rest of the Cosmere. Personally, I enjoyed all 4 of these novels, with my favorite being this one, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, which is just a really beautiful story. And this illustrated hardcover is also a really beautiful book, so definitely recommend grabbing that if you can. But yeah, overall, these 4 books are worth the wait. They're all really good. They're all unique. They're also all standalone stories, and they are a great way to wind down your Cosmere journey as we are getting to the end here. All right, and last but not least, well, maybe least, is Arcanium Unbounded, which is a collection of Cosmere short stories. So I would recommend reading Arcanium Unbounded only after you've read pretty much everything else in the Cosmere. This collection of short stories has short stories relating to Elantris and Mistborn and Stormlight Archive, and you are going to appreciate it a lot more and also avoid having things spoiled for you if you've already read those series and those books. So for those reasons, Arcanium Unbounded is a great book to finish your Cosmere journey with, for now. All right, so that is my personal recommended reading order guide for Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere. I'm filming this in February of 2026, so there could be 5, 10, 50 more books out in the Cosmere. We all know how Brandon Sanderson does. So I can't say that this guide will stay up to date, but for now, I think this is a relatively optimal way to read the books in the Cosmere. Now, just want to reiterate, this is very subjective. Brandon Sanderson himself has a video out of his recommended reading order, so definitely go check that out and approach it however you see fit. But this is just how I would recommend it to a new reader who's not sure where to start. Anyway, that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching. I would greatly appreciate if you like, subscribe, drop a comment. Tell me if you agree or disagree. Tell me what order you read the Cosmere books in, or where you're currently at in your Cosmere journey. I'm currently a very small content creator, so every single interaction means a lot to me, and I'd love to talk to more of you. So yeah, stop by and say hi. Would love it if you did. That's all I've got for today. Happy reading, enjoy your Cosmere journey, and have a great rest of your day.